The city smelled of old stone and rain-slicked promises, a scent Alex had come to associate with the hunt. Not for blood, but for a more delicate and devastating prize. He stood across the cobbled square from the small, independent gallery, the gaslights casting a halo of bruised gold around its entrance. Inside, through the wide pane of glass, he could see her. Ava. A splash of defiant crimson in a room of muted charcoals and navies, her hair a wild tangle of auburn curls that seemed to capture the very light he was forbidden to touch. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a gesture of such unbridled freedom it was like a physical blow. This was the daughter of Marcus Thorne, the man who had burned his world to ash. And she was beautiful. Not in the brittle, lacquered way of the women in his court, but in the way of a storm gathering over the sea, vital, untamed, and utterly unaware of the destruction she could cause. His plan was a thing of cruel artistry, honed over a century of loss. A masterpiece of vengeance painted in colors of seduction and heartbreak. He would become her world, the center of her orbit, the sun she could not look away from. He would learn the texture of her soul, the rhythm of her heart, the every secret whispered in the dark. And when she was so utterly his that the thought of a life without him was an impossible void, he would shatter her. He would leave her with the wreckage and a single, searing lesson, that her father's crusade had a cost to be paid by the one thing the hunter held dear. It was a cold, perfect calculus. He pushed away from the damp wall, the fine wool of his coat a whisper against the stone. He moved with a liquid grace that belied the ancient stillness within him, each step a deliberate note in the overture to her ruin. As he crossed the square, the chatter from the gallery's open door washed over him, the clink of glasses, the murmur of appreciation, the bright, sharp sound of her laughter again. It grated on him, that sound. It was the sound of a life untouched by the kind of grief that hollows a man out from the inside. He would soon rectify that. He paused at the threshold, allowing the human warmth of the room to press against his cold skin. He was a creature of shadow stepping into a pool of light, and he felt the gazes turn, drawn by the stark contrast he presented. He was dressed in black, from the polished leather of his shoes to the silk of his shirt, a slash of midnight in the cheerful gallery. He let his eyes scan the room, a slow, deliberate sweep, before allowing them to land on her. For a fraction of a second, he let his own mask slip, allowing the vast, empty chasm of his existence to flicker in their depths before schooling his features into a look of polite, detached interest. She felt his gaze before she saw him. It was a physical sensation, like a sudden drop in temperature, a prickling along the fine hairs of her arms. Her laughter died in her throat. She turned, and their eyes met across the crowded room. He was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever seen. He wasn't handsome in a conventional way, his features were too sharp, his cheekbones too severe, his mouth a thin, unforgiving line. But his eyes, they were ancient, filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to pull the very air from her lungs. In them, she saw the ruins of empires, the ghosts of forgotten stars. And they were fixed, entirely, on her. He held her gaze for 3 heartbeats, a silent conversation that spoke of things she could not yet comprehend. Then, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned his attention to the art on the walls. Her art. Charcoal sketches, raw and emotional, capturing the fleeting, fractured beauty of the city's forgotten corners. He moved from piece to piece with the focused intensity of a true connoisseur, his posture radiating a quiet, unassailable authority. He didn't just look, he consumed. His stillness before each piece was a form of reverence she had never witnessed. Ava found her feet moving of their own accord, drawn by an invisible thread. She navigated the clusters of chattering guests, her mind a blank slate save for the image of the stranger's eyes. "You have a remarkable eye for desolation," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the space between her ribs. He hadn't turned, his gaze still fixed on a sketch of a lone, skeletal tree in a forgotten churchyard. "You find the beauty in the breakage." Thank you," she managed, her voice feeling thin and unfamiliar. "I find there's more truth in what's broken than what's whole." He finally turned to face her, and the full force of his presence was overwhelming. Up close, the sorrow in his eyes was even more pronounced, a living, breathing thing. "A dangerous philosophy," he murmured, his lips barely moving. A ghost of a smile touched their corners, a fleeting, melancholy expression that did nothing to warm the chill of his gaze. But a compelling one. He extended a hand, his skin pale as marble in the gallery's light. Alexander Sterling. Ava Thorne. She placed her hand in his. His touch was cold. Not unpleasant, but a deep, profound cold, like a stone pulled from the bottom of a river. It was a shock against the warmth of her own skin, a jolt that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. The contact lasted only a moment, but the sensation lingered, a phantom chill. Ava, he repeated, the name a soft caress on the air. It suits you. He was already weaving the first threads of his web, his words chosen with surgical precision. He spoke of her art, of the light and shadow she captured, using language that showed he understood not just the technique, but the emotion, the very soul she poured onto the paper. He saw her. Or rather, he made her believe he did. And for Ava, who had spent her life feeling like a ghost in her own father's house, a vibrant anomaly in a world of rigid dogma, being seen was a powerful, intoxicating poison. She drank it down, oblivious to the fact that it was he who had brewed it, just for her. The perfect vengeance was not a loud, fiery thing. It was a quiet, insidious poison, administered with a gentle hand and a sad, beautiful smile. And it had already begun its work. His world was one of velvet darkness and whispered edicts, of power held for so long it had become as natural and unconscious as breathing. Her world was a chaotic symphony of color and light, the reek of turpentine and linseed oil, the glorious, messy freedom of creation. Alexander wove himself into the fabric of her life with a patience that was terrifying in its perfection. He never rushed, never pushed. He was simply there, a constant, quiet presence at the edge of her whirlwind existence. He would appear at the door of her studio, a small volume of poetry in hand, or a single, perfect night-blooming jasmine whose scent would fill the space for days. He learned the specific roast of coffee she preferred, the way she hummed off-key when a piece was going well, the frustrated sigh that signaled a creative block. For Ava, it was like coming home to a place she'd never known. Her father, Marcus, loved her in his own severe, distracted way, but he saw her art as a frivolous distraction from the righteous, holy war that consumed his life. He looked at her canvases and saw only wasted time. Alexander looked at them and saw her soul. He would sit for hours in the worn armchair in the corner of her studio, utterly still, watching her work. He never offered critique unless asked, and when he did, his insights were so astute, so deeply perceptive, they would unlock something inside her she hadn't known was trapped. "You're afraid of color," he observed one afternoon, his voice a soft murmur in the sun-drenched silence. Ava froze, her brush hovering over a canvas of muted grays and blues. "What? That's ridiculous. I'm a painter." "You are a master of shadow and line," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You render form with a truth that is breathtaking. But your color, it is hesitant. You use it as an accent, a flourish. You hold it at a distance, as if you're afraid of its power. Afraid it will consume you." His words struck a chord so deep within her it resonated with a painful hum. He was right. Color was emotion, raw and untethered. It was joy and fury and grief and passion, and she had always kept it contained, controlled, leashed by the stark discipline of her charcoal lines. It was too much. Too revealing. "Show me," he said, rising from his chair with that unnerving, silent grace. He came to stand behind her, his presence a cool shadow at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the chill radiating from him, a stark contrast to the warm afternoon light slanting through the high studio window. "What color is rage?" Her hand trembled. She squeezed a dollop of cadmium red onto her palette. "Bolder," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. "That is mere anger. I want the color of a heart set on fire. The color of vengeance." A shiver traced its way down her spine. The word vengeance hung in the air between them, charged and dangerous. Unthinking, her fingers dipped into the paint, and she smeared a vicious, brilliant slash of pure crimson across the canvas. It was a wound, a scream. And it was liberating. She followed it with a deep, violent purple, a sunburst of toxic yellow, a chasm of abyssal blue. She forgot he was there, forgot everything but the canvas and the riot of feeling she was finally unleashing. She painted until her arm ached and her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands and forearms stained with a testament to her newfound courage. When she finally stepped back, she was looking at something wild and beautiful and terrifying. It was the truest thing she had ever painted. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. There was an expression on his face she couldn't decipher, a flicker of something that looked like pained admiration, or perhaps regret. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual gentle, encouraging smile. "There," he said softly. "That is what you are capable of." In that moment, she loved him. It was a sudden, breathtaking realization, as terrifying and exhilarating as the colors on her canvas. She loved him for seeing the part of her that had been locked away, for giving her the key, for not being afraid of the beautiful, monstrous thing he had helped her unleash. That night, she let him stay. His touch was still cold, a shock of winter against her summer skin, but she welcomed it. In the darkness of her small bedroom, with the scent of jasmine and turpentine clinging to the air, his coldness was a comfort, an anchor in the storm of her own newfound heat. He made love to her with a slow, reverent tenderness that felt like worship. Every touch was deliberate, every kiss a carefully placed word in a language she was only just beginning to learn. She believed she was teaching him about warmth, about life. She had no way of knowing that he was merely a scholar of her responses, a cartographer mapping the shores of her heart for the sole purpose of laying them to waste. He held her afterwards, his cool body a perfect contrast to her own flushed warmth, and listened to the steady, trusting beat of her heart against his silent chest. It was the most exquisite torture, and the most perfect, damning evidence of his impending victory. He was winning. He was destroying her, one gentle touch, one perceptive word at her in time. And she was thanking him for it. The end came not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating click of a door. It was her father's arrival that precipitated the collapse. Marcus Thorne appeared at her studio one afternoon, unannounced, his face a mask of grim fury. He was a man carved from judgment, his eyes the cold, hard gray of a winter sky. He carried with him the scent of iron and righteousness. "I know who he is," Marcus said, his voice devoid of warmth. He did not look at her art, did not acknowledge the vibrant life she had built for herself. His gaze was fixed on the single volume of Keats left on the armchair, the one Alex had read to her the night before. "I know what he is." Ava's heart seized. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Her father's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "Alexander Sterling. An old name. A cursed name. The last scion of the House of Volkov, a bloodline I thought I had extinguished a century ago." He finally looked at her, and the pity in his eyes was worse than the anger. "He is a vampire, Ava. And he is the son of the king I executed to cleanse this world of its filth." The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, a language from her father's dark, fanatical world that had no place in the sunlit haven of her studio. A vampire. The word was absurd, a relic from a Gothic novel. Alex was gentle. Alex was kind. Alex was cold. His skin was always cool to the touch. He only ever came to her after dusk. He moved with a silence that wasn't human. A dozen small, unsettling details coalesced into a monstrous, undeniable truth. "No," she whispered, the word a fragile defense against the oncoming tidal wave. "He is using you, child," Marcus said, his voice softening with a cruel sort of sympathy. "He is using you to get to me. To inflict the same pain I inflicted upon his family." The air left her lungs. The color drained from the world, leaving only the stark, unforgiving lines of reality. The praise, the tenderness, the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing in the universe that mattered, it was all a lie. A performance. A weapon crafted to destroy her. She felt a nausea so profound she had to grip the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. She didn't wait for her father to say more. She ran. She ran through the streets of the city that had become her sanctuary, the city he had taught her to see in a new light. Now every corner held a memory that had become poisoned, every shadow seemed to mock her. She ran to his townhouse, a place of quiet, opulent elegance that had always felt like a refuge. She didn't knock. The door was unlocked, as it always was for her. He was in the library, standing by the cold fireplace, a glass of dark red liquid in his hand. He looked up as she burst in, his expression unreadable. He was not surprised to see her. "He told you," Alex said. "It wasn't a question." "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a grief so large it felt like it would tear her apart. "All of it." He took a slow sip from his glass, his eyes never leaving hers. He set the glass down with a soft, deliberate click. He offered no denial, no explanation. The silence was his confession. "Why?" The word was a raw, ragged sob. "I loved you. I thought you loved me." He looked at her then, and the man she had fallen in love with was gone. In his place was a king, ancient and cold and utterly merciless. The gentle sadness in his eyes was replaced by a chilling emptiness, a void that mirrored the one he had just carved into her soul. "Love." He tilted his head, a gesture of mild, academic curiosity. That was not part of the equation. He walked towards her, and she flinched back, a small, wounded animal. He stopped a few feet away, his face a mask of detached indifference. "This was about your father. This was about showing him that his actions have consequences that reach beyond the battlefield. That the deepest wounds are not inflicted with a sword, but with a carefully chosen word, a well-timed touch." Each word was a nail hammered into her heart. She could feel herself shattering, breaking apart into 1,000 pieces. "It was all a lie," she whispered, desperate for him to deny it, to show her one sliver of the man she thought she knew. He gave her nothing. His expression was one of cold, clinical finality. He looked down at her, at the beautiful, vibrant woman he had meticulously broken, and delivered the killing blow. "Consider it a lesson," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "A lesson not to trust people so easily." That was it. The culmination of his century-long plan. The final, perfect brushstroke on his masterpiece of revenge. He had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a cathartic release of the grief and rage he had carried for so long. He had expected to feel the satisfaction of a debt finally paid. He felt nothing. Just the vast, silent emptiness of the room, and the echoing sound of her broken heart. He watched her turn and walk away, her back straight, her movements stiff with shock. He watched until she was gone, and then he stood alone in the silence, the victor in a war that had cost him the only light he had known in 100 years. The lesson, he was beginning to realize with a dawning, sickening horror, had not been for her at all. It had been for him. London was a city of ghosts. For Ava, it was a sanctuary of anonymity, a place vast enough to swallow her grief whole. She had fled there with nothing but a small suitcase and the fellowship she'd been awarded months before, an offer she'd almost declined because she couldn't bear the thought of leaving Alex. The irony was a constant, bitter ache in her chest. The fellowship provided a small, stark studio in a sprawling, repurposed warehouse filled with other artists, a community of creators who asked no questions and respected the fierce, protective bubble of privacy she wrapped around herself. For the first 6 months, she couldn't paint. The very smell of turpentine made her stomach clench. Color felt like a betrayal. Every canvas was a blank, mocking accusation. Her hands, which had once moved with such confident grace, felt like foreign objects, clumsy and useless. The vibrant, passionate artist Alex had supposedly unlocked had been a lie, a construct of his making, and with him gone, she was gone, too. She spent her days walking the grey, rain-washed streets, a ghost among millions, her heart a numb, heavy stone in her chest. His final words echoed in the silence of her nights, a lesson not to trust people so easily. The coldness of it, the sheer, dismissive cruelty, was a wound that refused to heal. The first letter arrived 3 months after she'd left. It was addressed in an elegant, archaic script she recognized instantly. Her hands shook as she held the thick, cream-colored envelope. For a moment, a wild, stupid hope flared within her, a hope that it was all a mistake, that he would explain, that he would apologize. She tore it open, her heart hammering against her ribs. But as her eyes fell upon the first line, "My dearest Ava," the rage returned, hot and cleansing. Dearest? How dare he? She didn't read another word. She took the letter and her lighter to the small metal sink in her studio and set it on fire. She watched the elegant script blacken and curl into ash, the name Alexander Sterling turning to dust. It was a small, satisfying act of destruction. The letters kept coming. One every week, like clockwork. Each one delivered by a private courier, each one on the same expensive stationery. And each one, she burned. Unread. It became a ritual, a weekly exorcism. The brief flare of the flame was a moment of control in a life that had been stripped of it. She refused to let his words, his excuses, his perfectly crafted apologies, invade the fragile peace she was trying to build. Slowly, painfully, she began to work again. She started not with paint, but with charcoal. She returned to the stark, unforgiving medium of her past, to the comfort of black and white. Her work was different now. The romantic desolation was gone, replaced by something harder, more brutal. She drew fractured cityscapes, buildings that looked like they were screaming, portraits of faces with hollow, empty eyes. Her art was raw, wounded, and unflinchingly honest. It was the only place she could put the pain. One night, walking home late from the studio, her path through a deserted alley was blocked by two men. A familiar, primal fear seized her, but before they could take more than a step towards her, a shadow detached itself from a deeper shadow. There was no sound, just a sudden, violent blur of movement. It was over in seconds. One moment the men were there, menacing and real, the next they were gone, vanished into the darkness as if they had never existed. A tall, slender figure stood for a single heartbeat at the far end of the alley, silhouetted against a distant streetlight, and then he, too, was gone. She knew. She didn't know how, but she knew it was him. Or someone he had sent. The realization was terrifying and infuriating. He was watching her. He had no right. The next week, a rival at the fellowship, a painter named Julian whose envy had curdled into a nasty stream of gossip and slander about her work, suddenly packed his bags and left. He gave no explanation, his face pale and tight with a fear he couldn't hide. The whispers about Ava's unoriginal and derivative style stopped overnight. Again, she felt the invisible, manipulative touch of Alex's influence. He was clearing her path, protecting her from the shadows, but it didn't feel like protection. It felt like another violation, another exertion of his power over her life, a reminder that she could not truly escape him. 2 years passed in this strange, silent dance. 2 years of weekly letters, burned unread. 2 years of feeling a distant, guardian presence she refused to acknowledge. 2 years of pouring her heartbreak and her fury onto canvas after canvas. Her work gained a following in the London art scene. The raw, emotional power of her pieces resonated with people. A prestigious gallery owner, a woman named Eleanor Vance, saw her work and offered her a solo exhibition. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for, the validation she had craved. It was her chance to reclaim her own narrative, to prove that she was not a broken thing he had left behind, but an artist forged in the fire of his betrayal. As the opening night of her exhibition, titled Lessons, approached, a different kind of letter arrived. It was from her father. It was short, the words stiff and uncharacteristically hesitant. "He has called it off," Marcus wrote. "The vendetta against our family, against all hunters. It's over. He has disbanded his council of war, withdrawn his assassins. I don't understand it. He said he was doing it for you." Ava stared at the letter, her hands trembling. Disbanding a centuries-old war? Abdicating a quest for vengeance that had defined his entire existence. It was an impossible, monumental act. And he had done it for her. This wasn't a shadow in an alleyway or a silenced rival. This was the movement of kingdoms, the rewriting of history. For the first time in 2 years, the thick walls she had built around her heart began to crack. That week, when the cream-colored envelope arrived, she did not burn it. She placed it, unopened, in a locked drawer with her father's letter. She couldn't bring herself to read it, not yet. But she couldn't bring herself to destroy it, either. In the first year after she left, Alex's existence was a study in ash. The initial, hollow victory of his revenge had quickly given way to a grief more profound than any he had ever known, even the grief for his slaughtered family. That had been a sharp, clean wound, a cauterizing agony that had forged him into a king of vengeance. This new grief was a slow-acting poison, corrupting everything from the inside out. He had destroyed the only thing that had ever made him feel alive, and in doing so, had consigned himself to a hell of his own making. His palace, once a seat of power and dark purpose, became a mausoleum. He walked its silent, echoing halls, haunted by the ghost of her laughter, the memory of her scent, turpentine and jasmine, a phantom fragrance that clung to him, a constant, mocking reminder of what he had thrown away. He saw her everywhere, in the crimson splash of wine in a glass, in the defiant tangle of a wild rose in the garden, in the raw, emotional power of the Goya paintings that lined his library walls. He had sought to teach her a lesson in pain, and had instead become its most devoted student. His first letter to her was a stilted, prideful thing, more of a demand for an audience than an apology. He wrote it in a fit of arrogant frustration, unable to comprehend why the silence from her was so deafening. He had it delivered, expecting a furious, immediate reply. None came. He waited a week, the silence stretching his nerves taut. He wrote again, the tone softening slightly, an attempt at explaining his motives, framing his actions in the grand, tragic narrative of his past. Again, nothing. It was then that he began to understand. She was not playing a game. She had excised him from her life as cleanly as a surgeon removes a tumor. The realization broke him. The last vestiges of his kingly pride crumbled, leaving only the raw, agonizing truth of his regret. He had not just broken her heart, he had broken his own. He began to write to her every week, not with any expectation of a reply, but because it was the only thing he could do. The letters became his confessional, his penance. He poured everything into them, his self-loathing, his remorse, the story of his family, the crushing weight of his immortality. He told her about the moment he knew he loved her, that afternoon in her studio, when she had unleashed her fear of color onto the canvas. He had seen her true, brilliant, terrifying soul, and in that moment, his carefully constructed plan of vengeance had turned to dust. But he had been a coward, too trapped in the narrative of his own making to admit it, and so he had proceeded with the execution, even as it killed him. He knew she would never read the words, but he wrote them anyway, casting them into the void like prayers. He couldn't stay away. He went to London, taking up residence in an anonymous, shadowed corner of the city. He needed to know she was safe. He became her unseen guardian, a ghost in the periphery of her life. He watched her walk the grey streets, her face pale and drawn, and his failure was a physical ache in his silent chest. He dispatched the thugs in the alley with a cold, silent fury, not for their intended crime, but for the fear they had put in her eyes. He dealt with the slandering artist, Julian, not with violence, but with a quiet, terrifying conversation in the dead of night, showing the man a glimpse of the abyss that awaited those who harmed what was his. The man had fled, understanding completely. These were small, selfish acts, attempts to soothe his own guilt, and he knew it. They were not for her. They were for him. And they were not enough. His grand, all-consuming vendetta against the hunters, against her father, now felt like a petty, childish obsession. It was the legacy of a boy, not a king. It was the cage he had built for himself. And it was the reason he had lost her. It had to end. The process was monumental. It meant facing down his oldest retainers, vampires who had served his family for centuries and whose identities were inextricably linked to the war. He faced accusations of treason, of madness, of betraying his own blood. He was ruthless. He broke his own counsel, exiled his most vocal opponents, and single-handedly dismantled the entire apparatus of vengeance his family had spent generations building. He sent a formal declaration to Marcus Thorne, a treaty of unconditional and permanent cessation. He asked for nothing in return. It was an act of complete surrender. The war was over. He had finally chosen. He had chosen her. He knew about the exhibition. He had followed her career from afar, his heart swelling with a painful, distant pride at her success. Her gallery was a well-respected one, and a solo show was a major achievement. He knew he had no right to be there, that his presence would be a violation, a disruption of her triumph. But he could not stay away. This was her moment, the culmination of 2 years of pain that he had caused. He had to see it. He had to witness the beautiful, terrible thing that had grown from the wreckage he had made of her heart. He would not speak to her, would not approach her. He would simply be a ghost in the crowd, a silent witness. That was the plan. But as he stood before the gallery on that cold London night, the plan, like all his others where she was concerned, felt like a fool's errand. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that tonight, the silence between them would finally have to break. The gallery was humming with energy, a warm, bright space filled with conversation and the clinking of wine glasses. Ava moved through it in a daze, accepting congratulations, smiling until her cheeks ached. Her work was on display, her soul laid bare on the white walls for all to see, and she felt a terrifying mixture of pride and exposure. The collection, Lessons, was a chronological journey through her 2 years of exile and recovery. The early pieces were stark, monochromatic, filled with jagged lines and a sense of claustrophobic despair. Then, slowly, tentatively, color began to creep back in. Muted blues and bruised purples at first, then angry slashes of crimson, and finally, in the last few pieces, a defiant, hopeful burst of sunflower yellow and cerulean blue. It was the story of her survival. And then he walked in. The low hum of the room didn't just quiet, it was extinguished, as if a vacuum had sucked all the sound from the air. Every head turned towards the entrance. Alex stood there, a figure of stark, funereal elegance against the cheerful backdrop of the gallery. He was not the same man she had known. The cold, kingly arrogance was gone, stripped away. He looked haunted. Thinner, his severe cheekbones more pronounced, and the ancient sorrow in his eyes had deepened into a raw, open wound. He wore his grief like a shroud. Their eyes met across the room, and the world fell away. There was only the silent, charged space between them, a space filled with 2 years of unspoken words, of burned letters and phantom touches. His gaze was a physical weight, a plea, an apology, a catalogue of every regret he had ever known. She felt her carefully constructed composure begin to fracture. Her heart, that foolish, traitorous muscle, gave a painful lurch. She wanted to scream at him, to throw a glass of wine in his perfect, tragic face. She wanted to run to him, to press her palm against his cheek and ask him if he was all right. The contradictory impulses warred within her, leaving her frozen, breathless. He broke the contact first, his gaze dropping to the floor for a brief moment as if in deference, before he began to move through the gallery. He didn't look at the people who stared, who whispered behind their hands. He had eyes only for her work. He moved with a slow, reverent pace, stopping before each piece, his focus absolute. He wasn't just looking, he was reading. He was reading the story she had written in charcoal and paint, the story of the pain he had inflicted. She watched him trace the journey from the broken, colorless beginnings to the fragile, hopeful end, and she saw his shoulders slump, his hands clench into fists at his sides. He was seeing the consequences of his actions, not as an abstract concept, but as a visceral, visual reality. He reached the final piece, a large canvas dominated by a brilliant, defiant sunrise over a grey, sleeping city. It was the most hopeful thing she had ever painted. He stood before it for a long time, his back to her, his stillness a testament to some powerful internal struggle. Eleanor Vance, the gallery owner, approached him cautiously, a red-soled sticker in her hand for another patron. "It's a powerful piece, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her voice professional but warm. Alex didn't turn. "It is," he said, his own voice low and rough, as if it hadn't been used in some time. "They all are." He finally turned to face the gallery owner, and Ava could see the resolve that had settled on his features. "I'll take them." Eleanor blinked. "I'm sorry." "All of them," he repeated, his gaze sweeping the room. "Every piece. I'm buying the entire collection." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's professional smile faltered. "Mr. Sterling, is it? The collection is. It's a significant investment. Several pieces are already spoken for. I will pay double what the others have offered," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an absolute authority that brooked no argument. "And I will pay you a price for the rest that will ensure you do not feel the loss of your commission. Name it." Eleanor was speechless. This was unprecedented. Ava felt a fresh wave of fury. This was what he did. He used his power, his wealth, to control everything, to manipulate every situation. He thought he could buy her forgiveness, buy his way back into her life with a grand, ostentatious gesture. She started towards him, a protest already forming on her lips, but stopped when she saw what he did next. In the corner of the room, a small stage was set up for a string duo that was scheduled to play later. A beautiful, dark wood cello rested on a stand. Alex walked to the stage, picked up the instrument as if it were an extension of his own body, and Saturday. He didn't ask permission. He simply acted. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. He took a moment, his eyes closed, and then he began to play. The music that filled the gallery was not a known composition. It was raw, immediate, and achingly personal. It began with a low, mournful melody, a single, lonely voice in a vast, empty darkness. It spoke of ancient loss, of a heart turned to stone, of a world seen only in shades of grey. Then, a new theme emerged, a lighter, more vibrant melody, full of chaotic, unpredictable warmth. It was her theme, Ava's theme. The two melodies intertwined, a dance of tentative curiosity, of shadow and light. The music swelled, growing in passion and intensity, a story of connection, of a cold heart beginning to thaw. Then, the crash. A discordant, violent scherzo. The two themes tore apart, the cello screaming with the sound of betrayal, of a trust shattered into a million pieces. It was the sound of her heartbreak, rendered in gut-wrenching, agonizing detail. He was playing their story. He was playing his crime. And he was not sparing himself. The music was a confession, a flagellation. After the storm of the betrayal, the music fell into a quiet, desolate passage. It was the sound of the aftermath, of 2 years of silence and regret. The lonely theme from the beginning returned, but it was different now, no longer cold and hard, but filled with a profound, desperate longing. Slowly, painfully, he began to weave her theme back in, not as it was, but as a memory, a ghost of a melody he was trying to recall. The piece ended not with a grand resolution, but with a single, questioning note that hung in the air, a plea left unanswered. Hope, fragile and terrifying. When the last note faded, the silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Alex remained seated, his head bowed over the cello, his shoulders shaking with a silent, racking grief. He had stripped himself bare in front of a room full of strangers, offering his shame, his remorse, his love as the only defense he had left. He had not used words. He had used the only language he knew she might still be willing to hear. He had used art. And in the resonant silence that followed, Ava felt the last of her anger dissolve, replaced by a vast, aching, and terrifying wave of understanding. This was not a performance. This was the sound of a man's soul breaking open. The crowd remained frozen for a long moment, caught in the wake of the raw emotion that had washed over the room. Then, as if a spell had been broken, they erupted into applause. It was not polite, appreciative clapping, it was a thunderous, heartfelt ovation, a response not just to the technical brilliance of the performance, but to the staggering vulnerability they had just witnessed. Alex didn't seem to hear it. He slowly placed the cello back on its stand, his movements heavy, exhausted. He rose and turned, his eyes searching the crowd until they found hers. The applause, the stares, the whispers, none of it registered. In that crowded, noisy room, they were the only two people in existence. Eleanor Vance, ever the professional, seized the moment of stunned silence that followed the applause. "Well," she said, her voice bright but a little shaky, "it appears the entire lessons collection is now sold." The announcement jolted Ava into action. She pushed through the throng of people, ignoring their curious glances and murmured questions. She needed to get to him. She needed air. She met him near the back of the gallery, beside a door that led to a small, private office. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside her. He simply nodded, his eyes full of a weary, desperate hope. He followed her into the small, cluttered office, and she shut the door behind them, plunging them into a sudden, intimate quiet. The muffled sounds of the party outside seemed a world away. For a long minute, they just stood there, facing each other in the dim light. The silence was thick with everything that had been left unsaid for 2 years. "That was quite a show," she said finally, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It was a weak defense, but the only one she could muster. "It wasn't a show," he replied, his voice raspy. "It was the truth. The only way I knew how to tell it. The truth." Her voice rose, laced with the first tremor of the pain he had so expertly resurrected. "You want to talk about truth, Alex? Which truth is that? The one where you told me you loved my work, or the one where you were using it to map the fastest route to breaking me?" He flinched as if she had struck him. "Both were true," he said quietly. "That was my sin. I came to you with a heart full of vengeance, and you filled it with something else. I saw the truth in your art, Ava. I saw you. And I fell in love with you. I was just too much of a coward to admit that my perfect, righteous revenge had been corrupted by something as simple and profound as loving my enemy's daughter." "Love," she scoffed, the sound sharp and brittle. "You don't destroy the people you love. You don't look them in the eye and tell them they were a lesson." "I know," he whispered, and the self-loathing in his voice was a palpable thing. He took a hesitant step closer, his hands held open at his sides in a gesture of surrender. "That man, the one who said that to you. I have spent every day for the last 2 years trying to kill him. He was a king who thought power was control. He was a fool who thought breaking you would make him whole." He looked down at his own pale, empty hands. "I have never felt more broken than in the moment I watched you walk away." She wanted to hold on to her anger. It was a shield, a familiar weight that had protected her for so long. But seeing him now, stripped of all his power and pride, seeing the genuine agony in his eyes, she felt her defenses crumbling. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, her voice softer now, laced with a weary vulnerability. "The money, the music, those are just grand gestures, Alex. You've always been good at those. They are all I have," he said. "I can't undo what I did. I can't take back the pain I caused. God knows, I would trade my immortality for the chance to go back to that day and beg for your forgiveness instead of what I did. All I can do is show you who I am now. The war is over, Ava. Not just with your father. The war inside me. I chose. For 100 years, I chose vengeance. But when it came down to it, when I had to choose between my past and a future that might, one day, have you in it, I chose you. I will always choose you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. Her sketchbook. The one she had lost, the one she thought was gone forever, filled with her earliest, most private drawings from when they first met. "I kept this," he said, holding it out to her. "When I wanted to remember what was real. Before the lie." She took the book, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was still cold, but the chill no longer felt sinister. It just felt like him. She opened the book. On the first page, in his elegant script, was a single sentence, written recently in fresh ink. "I am sorry." 3 simple words, stripped of all poetry and performance. She looked from the book to his face. The hope in his eyes was so fragile it was heartbreaking. He was offering her the broken pieces of himself, with no guarantee that she would, or even could, put them back together. He had bought her art, her pain, not as a trophy, but as a penance, a way to carry the evidence of his crime with him always. He hadn't performed to win her back, he had performed to confess, to show her the truth of his regret in a way that words never could. "This doesn't fix it, Alex," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect it to. I don't deserve forgiveness. I only ask for a chance to earn it. However long it takes." She closed the sketchbook, clutching it to her chest. The anger was gone. The hate was gone. In their place was a vast, uncertain quiet. She was not the same girl he had betrayed 2 years ago. And he was not the same man who had betrayed her. They were 2 survivors of a wreck he had caused, standing in the rubble, wondering if anything could be salvaged. Her decision was not a conscious one. It rose from a place deeper than thought, a place where the memory of his hand on her back and the sound of his voice reading poetry still lived. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. It was something far more terrifying, and far more hopeful. It was a beginning. "The gallery is closing soon," she said, her voice quiet but firm, a stark contrast to the emotional cataclysm of the last hour. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the exhausted lines around his eyes, the desperate sincerity in his gaze. He was waiting for her verdict, braced for the final, deserved blow of her rejection. He had given her all the power, and the unfamiliar weight of it settled on her shoulders. Forgiveness felt too simple, too easy a word for the chasm between them. Trust was a country she wasn't sure she could ever visit again. But the man standing before her was not the cold king who had sent her into exile. This was a man who had dismantled his own world for a chance to stand in hers again. "I know," he said, his voice hushed, accepting. He expected her to ask him to leave, to disappear from her life as thoroughly as he had disappeared from the alleyway after saving her. She took a deep breath, the air in the small office tasting of dust and old paper and the faintest, lingering scent of his ozone and winter presence. "My studio," she said, the words feeling strange and momentous on her tongue. "It's not far from here." Hope, stark and brilliant, flared in his eyes. It was so intense, so unguarded, that she almost looked away. He didn't speak, didn't dare to breathe, for fear the fragile offer would shatter. "You bought all my work," she continued, a faint, wry smile touching her lips for the first time that night. "I think that earns you the right to see where it was made. To see the place where I put it all back together." It was a test. She was inviting him into her sanctuary, the space she had built from the ashes of his betrayal. She was showing him that she had not remained broken. She had rebuilt. And she was giving him the choice to enter that new world, not as a king, not as a manipulator, but as a guest. "Ava," he breathed, her name a prayer. "Don't," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't say anything else. No more grand speeches. No more music. Just walk with me." He nodded, a single, sharp movement of his head, his throat too tight for words. He understood. This was not absolution. This was a single step on a journey of 1,000 miles, a journey he would have to make on his knees if necessary. They left the office and slipped out a back door, avoiding the lingering crowd and the curious eyes of the gallery owner. The London night was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of wet pavement and distant river traffic. The sky was a blanket of starless, bruised purple. For several blocks, they walked in silence. It was not the strained, agonizing silence of the gallery, but something new. A quiet space where they could simply exist, side by side. Ava was intensely aware of him, of the whisper of his long coat, of the way he kept a respectful, careful distance from her, as if afraid the slightest touch might spook her and send her fleeing. He, in turn, was aware of everything about her. The determined set of her jaw, the way she clutched her old sketchbook to her chest like a shield, the faint, familiar scent of oil paint that clung to her clothes. To be this close to her again, to be walking beside her under a night sky, was a privilege so profound it made his immortal heart ache. He drank in the sight of her, committing every detail to memory, terrified that this might be the only time, that the dawn would come and she would change her mind. Her studio was on the top floor of the warehouse, a vast, open space with a huge arched window that looked out over the slumbering city. The moment she unlocked the door and stepped inside, he felt the shift. This was her kingdom. The air was thick with her scent, her energy. Canvases in various stages of completion were everywhere, leaning against walls, stacked on easels. Jars bristling with brushes stood on paint-spattered tables. It was a space of chaotic, beautiful creation. It was her. She switched on a single, low-watt lamp, casting a pool of warm, golden light in the center of the room, leaving the corners in deep shadow. She turned to face him, her expression serious. "If this is going to happen," she said, her voice resonating with a newfound strength, "there are rules." "Anything," he said, his sincerity absolute. "No more lies. Ever. Not even small ones. I want the truth from you, Alex. The ugly, painful, difficult truth. Always. You will have it. No more secrets. No more grand, manipulative gestures. You don't get to fix things with money or power. You fix them by showing up. By being present. By talking. Even when it's hard. I understand. And you have to be patient," she said, and this was the hardest part. Her voice trembled slightly. You have to understand that I might never trust you the way I did before. That scar is always going to be there. You have to be willing to live with that. To earn back a little bit of my trust every single day, knowing you might never have all of it again." He met her gaze, and his own eyes were shining with unshed tears, a sight so impossible, so startling, that it took her breath away. A vampire, weeping. "To have a small piece of your trust, Ava," he said, his voice thick and raw, "would be a greater treasure than any kingdom I have ever known. I will spend the rest of my existence, however long that may be, earning it. I swear to you." She believed him. In that moment, she truly believed him. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the ghosts of their past. But for the first time in 2 years, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. She gestured to the worn armchair in the corner, the same one he used to sit in another lifetime, in another city. "Sit," she said. It was not a request. It was an invitation. He moved to the chair and sat, his posture not that of a king, but of a penitent. Ava picked up a clean canvas and placed it on her easel. She squeezed fat, vibrant dollops of paint onto her palette, crimson, gold, a deep, hopeful blue. She picked up a brush, her hand steady. She didn't know what she was going to paint. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, in her space, by her rules. He was quiet, watching her, his presence a familiar, comforting weight in the room. He was a man who had chosen her over vengeance, who had learned that true love was not about possession, but about the patient, painful, beautiful work of understanding. The work had just begun, and as she made the first, bold stroke of color on the blank canvas, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever. It was the color of a new lesson. The lesson of a second chance.